Someone asked me at the break about using ChatGPT for editing purposes. And a couple of thoughts about it. First of all, if you do that, most journals will require that you declare that you did that, which I think is important. The second is if English is your first language, ChatGPT is not going to do a better job than you, probably. If English is your second language, it might help some for parts, but you'll probably get better assistance by finding someone who's a good reader to look at it and help you. The third thing is once you put it in there, it is in the world for other people to draw from, whether it's been published or not. So meaning that ChatGPT will draw from it for other people. And that's why NIH doesn't allow you to use it for grant reviews. Like you cannot put a grant into ChatGPT because that's a private document. So I don't recommend using it generally. I think that it doesn't do that good a job in writing a lot of times for things like this. So until things get much better and we have a better system for protecting your own intellectual knowledge, I would try to avoid it and use human beings as much as possible.
I have started using Grammarly.
Yeah, Grammarly does not have the same issues. Grammarly is there to just fix your grammar, and yeah, me, and I can relate. And even just the word elements where it puts a little flag, pay attention to those little flags or like squiggles under the word, right click, see what it's suggesting, make an educated decision as to whether that comma should be there or not. Most of the time it's right. Every once in a while you're like, oh, I don't think that's quite right.
That's changed the meaning.
Yes, exactly. And when it changes the meaning, that's a problem. The other thing is you will have, like when you've published paper and you get your the manuscript back from the editor, the proofs back, there will be times if they have a copy editor that they will have made a mistake. Like every once in a while they will change the meaning of the sentence. So you have to read it carefully to make sure that they didn't change everything. If they're good, they will say, we changed this word with a little block and say, did we change the meaning? And then you have a chance to resist. The bigger journals like Lancet and JAMA and New England Journal will spend a lot of time doing that. And Lancet in particular, because it's a UK journal, will change all your words to UK spelling, which you have to get used to. And then they have a very formalized style, which I don't love, frankly, but you don't have as much choice there, so you can push back some, but not entirely. Other questions before we start?
I was curious about ChatGPT in writing, so I just put my writing in there, and it actually made it more verbose, and like a lot of filler words. So when we're thinking about writing concisely, I wouldn't.
Yeah. So just be wary. And I think there's nothing that replaces a human brain for these things yet. All right, so we're going to finish up today by talking about writing for your career. A lot of this is about time management and getting your writing done. And I'm just going to begin by reminding you that writing is like exercise, and you're better off doing it every day or nearly so, even when you don't feel like doing it. Just let that sink in for a second. Do it frequently, not in big bunches. So writing is hard. It takes a lot of energy, and a lot of the people that write professionally talk about how hard it is to do this every day, whether they're reporters or like people that write pieces for magazines or whatever. So we are professional writers, but we're sort of part-time professional writers. So it's even harder for us in a way because we aren't forced to do it every day because we have other stuff that we're supposed to do in addition. Whereas a reporter has to write every day. So when we think about scientific writing, you know, it's something we have to do. It's not something that's going to make us lots of money. If we want to make lots of money, write a novel, probably with a lot of sex. All right, so different publications have different values. We talked a little bit about this morning. Obviously, for your promotion purposes, a first author paper is going to have more value than a co-authored paper. But you really need both. Like if everything that you do is by yourself, that's going to be a struggle, right? Like, so find your way to connect with other people so you're part of their projects as well as your own. Do you want more papers in weaker journals versus fewer papers in strong journals? Well, all of us would choose to have lots of papers in strong journals if we could. But the reality is that we're going to have some weaker papers too. Like there are going to be some papers that we're like, okay, that's fine. But it's not necessarily our Nobel Prize winning work. How many papers do you need? Again, that goes to your expectations of your department and your school. Learn what's expected of you. Try to have multiple things in process at any given time. So you can increase your opportunities for publishing basically by having ongoing projects and manuscripts at the same time. If you only like do the project, write the paper, do the project, write the paper, it's going to be a much more difficult road for you down the line in terms of being able to show productivity. We talked about reviewing earlier. That will help you improve your skills. Figure out what works in a paper and what doesn't, what you like, what you don't like. It really helps to figure out your niche. And what I mean by that is you have a certain skill set that may be substantive, that may have some methods element to it. But when you're trying to think about where do I fit in the universe of my school, like having your niche of people want to turn to you for advice related to this, that's a very good thing, because that will give you opportunities. When you agree to be a part of a project, try to understand what you're being asked to do. Sometimes people are asking you to come in and rescue something. That's a very different circumstance than being asked to come in and be a co-author, right? Like it's something that's been languishing for them for months or years, and they're like, can you help me with this? And they never say, can you write this? But that's actually what they mean. Try to identify what I call cheap labor. That just means like students who are eager for this. You don't always have to pay them. They benefit from this process. They benefit from being part of the paper. And when you can engage them, they learn a lot. So just keep in mind that you want to do it in a fair way so that you're not taking advantage of them, but they are getting something out of this as well. And then try not to write things that won't be published. So what I mean by this is sometimes you might have to write a report for some organization, or maybe you're writing a grant and you've spent a ton of time figuring out the significant section of that grant. Well, maybe is there a possibility that you could turn that significant section with a little work into a thought piece or into a narrative review, something that will get published in addition to the grant. So authorship is challenging, and we brought it up a little bit this morning. I'm going to spend a little bit of time about navigating your co-authors here. So there's standard information about what merits authorship. So the International Committee for Medical Journal Editors, I think that's what it's called, has standard criteria that are basically substantial contribution with various parts, drafting it or revising it. You don't have to write anything technically. And then final approval and agreement to be accountable for all aspects of the work. And this is important, meaning that you have to be engaged enough with the other authors to be able to say, I'm confident that this is a good paper, like that this is valid. So in general, if you ask a co-author of a paper, this isn't always true, mind you, but if you ask a co-author on a paper, they should be able to tell you who did what on that paper. Now, when you get to big network kinds of things where the big consortium, that's often not the case. Like you may never have met some of your co-authors. But at the least you should know like who the lead was, what the senior author was doing, and that sort of thing. Any author should really meet all 4 criteria, and anyone who does meet all 4 criteria should be at least a co-author. And if you meet some of those but not all of them, then you should be acknowledged. And keep in mind that some journals require anyone that's acknowledged to be to send in a little note that says, I know that I'm being acknowledged on this paper. You will find differences of opinion about what merits authorship. So in medicine, typically if you helped collect the data, like from patients, you would expect to be a co-author. In public health, and especially epidemiology, where I am, we emphasize the people that do the analysis. And sometimes we forget about the people that actually collected the data, much to the anger of the people that actually collected the data. And I think that's quite reasonable. Like you should be angry if you spent all that time collecting the data, so jump up and down and make sure you're part of those papers.
I have a quick question about your cheap labor.
Yeah.
So, you know, I have a lot of papers that have to get written like over the summer. So I had some students, medical students, come in and they are, you know, they said they're eager. They want to be on paper. So, you know, I was going to have them help, you know, things like, you know, look through some literature, do little summaries, and, you know, send out what I have, and then I'll write it and maybe do some editing. Does that meet those 4 standards? Because I would put them on as a co-author. I certainly would not.
Yeah. No, the only thing you have to be sure of is that when the paper is actually done, that they get a chance to look at it, to comment, that sort of thing. Because what happens a lot is people come in, they help, and then they're left out of the rest of the process. Then technically they don't meet the criteria. So just make sure that if they are engaged at that stage, that you're able to keep them close enough that they can be part of the process.
Like they need to be engaged in the concept of design and all that.
Yeah, it's.
They're coming in
Whoops.
a little later in the game.
So no, so these are all or statements. So they can be involved in, like when you're talking about what you were saying, like in the literature review, that sort of element of like what's important, that goes into the interpretation of the data and that sort of thing. I interpret that quite broadly, personally. All right. My personal record is 29 authors. That took a long time to enter into the system.
So,
Uh-huh.
if you're the first author, you can ask other people to draft sections of
Yeah, for sure.
You don't have to do all the.
You don't have to have written the whole thing. They have to understand that you're still the first author and they're contributing, but it's not uncommon for like the biostatistician to write the methods section, or as I'll talk about it in a little bit, you might have someone who's more policy oriented help you think about the section that's sort of talking about the implications. That's totally fine.
I see more and more like two people, person I say with.
They're shared.
contribute equally.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about that in just a second. Any other questions? I thought I saw one more, but that one's coming, the shared co-authorship. All right, so who's the first author? Almost always it's the person that wrote the bulk of the paper. And that person will typically have had a role in developing the paper, meaning like the idea and that sort of thing. Not always, though. Sometimes it's like, it was my idea, I told them what to do, and they did it. The analyst is the first author. Quite commonly in epidemiology, an applied biostatistician would almost never expect to be the first author. So if you're working with an epidemiologist for your analysis, talk to them about what your expectations are. Sometimes you'll have co-first authors, so meaning that both people contributed equally. What is equal is a little bit unclear sometimes, but basically it means that they contributed somewhere equally in this whole process from idea to design to analysis to manuscript. And this is an example of a co-first author manuscript, and if you read the acknowledgments, the co-first authorship order was determined by the best of 3 rounds in Super Smash Brothers. So someone has to get listed first. Dr. Bai won the Smash Brothers game. But seriously, like, this co-first author thing has increased in frequency. I think it's reasonable. There's often, especially when you have more early career people, there are times when people are really contributing equally. I've not really seen it very much for co-last authors. In theory, that could be the case. Instead, like my colleague and I, who are pretty much the same stage of career, we just rotate back and forth sometimes. And at this stage, for me, it doesn't really matter. In biomedical fields, generally the last author is the senior author, like the, quote, the one that's the head of the lab or the research project. Often the analyst is second author, not necessarily. Second or third, quite commonly. But in social sciences, the second author is often that lead of the lab. So know who you're working with and understand their expectations. So co-authors can be challenging. And the idea is to be proactive and know what to expect as much as possible. So we're going to talk about when to talk about it, what should happen, what to expect, and improving the process. So when to talk about it? Early. Ideally before you start writing anything, even before the project starts if you can. Then bring it back up as needed throughout. And don't wait till the end except under special circumstances, because when you wait till the end, people's feelings get hurt, and that can sometimes be difficult to manage. What should happen when you're working with a co-author, this is someone critiquing Shakespeare here, your co-authors should be engaged and participatory. They should provide useful feedback. They should provide editorial suggestions. But what you can really expect is more like Lucy here, where they often contribute less than you want them to, and they can be a little bit difficult. Sometimes they will edit more than they comment when you're just looking for comments. And especially on early drafts, you're just looking for comments and you get back all these edits. So because writing with co-authors can be so challenging, the way to do this is to manage your co-authors. So it's much like managing your mentor, like you know what you need, so how do you get that from them? So with your co-authors, especially with early drafts are not really meant to be edited. Like you can do the editing between that early draft and the next draft. What you want from them is big picture comments. You want to know, did I leave something out? Does something not fit? Is my story coming through? Can you tell me what my one or two things I'm emphasizing are, or is that not clear? Those are the kinds of things you want coming out. And the way to do that is to guide them as explicitly as possible to what you're looking for. So when you send out your email with that text, or email linking it to your OneDrive, tell them, this is what I want from you. You don't have to have all of the information. So additional things that you can do to help are give deadlines. Like, one of the worst things is, and I'm definitely not good at this, but people will send me something, I'll say I'm going to look at it, and it takes me much too long. Sorry. Things can take time, so try to give deadlines, and then remind them of the deadline when it's closed. When you send out that early draft, be very explicit, like, I don't want you to fix my grammar and I don't want you to edit. Please don't. I want you to just pretend like you're reading it like a reviewer. That helps, actually, if you say read it like a reviewer, not like a editor. And explain exactly what you're looking for. I once worked a lot with a guy who was notorious for not giving any feedback, like none. But he was a co-author on things, so I needed him to look at things, at the least, and acknowledge that he had looked at it. But he was also really good at sort of some of the policy-related stuff. So I started telling him, when I sent the email, I'd say, look at the third paragraph of the discussion. That's all I need you to look at. One paragraph. And I'd have a big comment there for him with his name on it. And then he would go in and he would look at it, and remarkably, he then would give me comments on the whole thing. Because he read the third paragraph and he's like, I need to think about this, and he would read the whole thing and then give me comments. But that was the only way I could get him over the hump of, like, I'm essentially saying it's only going to take you 15 minutes to look at this. So give them some nugget that's going to pull them in to do what you need them to do. And actually, it was really helpful, because then he really worked on that, and he gave me a few useful comments throughout. Keep in mind that there will be people that think they're good writers who are not. There are many of them. Many of them are of the male persuasion. And your mission is to defend what you've done against them. So Zinsser was talking about it in relation to editors or publishers or whatever, but in our case, it's more likely co-authors who have strong opinions about something and they're totally wrong. Or they have strong opinions and you just have a different opinion. So you have to figure out how to negotiate those circumstances. I will remind you that if you're the first author, it is your paper. Therefore, technically, you have the final say. Now, sometimes you may be in a position where there's other powerful people around you on your paper, and you agree with some and not the others. Well, in those cases, draw in the people you agree with to fight your battles against the people that are pulling you in a different direction. You have to sort of get your mentorship support that's on the paper to help in the right direction. Now, when it's your mentor doing the things that you don't like, then you need to find someone else who can push back against them sometimes. But ultimately, again, it's your paper. You have the right to sort of overrule someone else. When you're the co-author, be the kind of co-author that you would want. Establish your role early, figure out like what your niche is. People send me things all the time to shorten them. I'm a master at making grants fit into the space that they need to fit in. I actually enjoy it because I get to slice words all over the place. And then be timely. Do the inverse of what I just said. So the paper comes into you. Before you look at it, say, what do you want me to focus on? Do you want me to just read it for content? Do you want me to edit it? What would you like? And you'll be surprised how often they're like, oh, I hadn't thought about what I want from you. And then they think about it and tell you what they want. And in that little interchange, you sort of change the dynamics for their future papers in a good way. And then provide feedback in the way that you would want it. So writing is really, really hard. Takes a lot of time and energy. And we have to figure out how to get that writing done. So a lot of times when we have trouble starting, it's because we're afraid of something. And figuring out what makes you afraid of writing is really important. And especially in the US, people learn to hate writing because we focus on the wrong things and don't really instill this like, oh, it's about communication, it's about telling a story, it's about like sharing something with other people in a positive way. And instead we get this sense of, oh, I'm just not very good at it. And then we want to stop. You're going to struggle. Like there are going to be times when it's really hard to do it. And every once in a while you'll just have a great writing day. But expecting to have a great writing day every day is going to be a disappointment. So, but with that in mind, people come up with all kinds of excuses about why they're not writing. So I can't find the time to write. I don't have a big enough block of time. That's a common one. I need a few more analyses. This is really common with PhD students. Like they don't want to start their dissertation because they want to do more analyses. I need a new something. If I only had a better desk, I would write. I need a new laptop. My office is terrible. I've asked for a new one. It's going to come sometime in the next, oh, actually probably 10 years, but I'm going to wait for that and then I'll write. I'm waiting until I feel like it. When I'm inspired. The inspiration doesn't magically come from above. All right. So how do we increase productivity and how do we write more effectively? And to do that, we have to understand ourselves, who we are, what makes us work. We have to look inward a little bit, know ourselves in terms of how we function, and then we have to really commit to being a good writer. So let's see if we can help. For those of you that were here for the 1 hour session, you can't answer this question. For those of you that have not heard this before, I'm asking you what is the most important part of your body for writing. So I had a brain, that's good. Anything else? Everybody thinks brain. Hands for your keyboard maybe. That's a good one. I'm going to say neither one of those. It's your butt. Or maybe your feet if you stand up to write. But you have to get your butt in the chair and your hands on the keyboard to do it. Because you can wander around thinking as much as you want, it will still not be written. Right? So put your butt in the chair. And I spend a lot of time in my head writing before I sit down. That's just how I do it, but then I have to sit down and do it. I've been struggling recently, again, with this. I've mentioned a paper before where I'm trying to write the methods. The whole paper, it's sort of a shared authorship thing. We've struggled a lot because we just haven't sat down and done it, and I haven't followed any of the rules that I'm about to tell you about to getting things done. So what I'm going to tell you will help you a lot, but you have to do them to make them work. All right, so making a schedule and sticking to it is really important. Several hours a week, every week, ideally write a little bit every day. We're going to talk about some of these in more detail. Commit to writing consistently. Write in places where you're comfortable and can think with minimal distraction. You don't have to be in your office. You don't have to be wherever. It just has to be a place where it works for you. Set specific goals. Identify the storyline and make sure you think about that every time. Use effective outlines. Stop when you're in a good place so you can easily pick up the next day. This is one that people struggle with a lot, but it really actually helps quite a bit. Because usually when we're writing well, we're like, oh, I'm writing well. I'm going to keep forging ahead and keep doing it. And then you get to a place where you're not writing well on that same day, and then you stop, and then the next day you're in a bad place. And then you don't want to do it because you were in a bad place. But if you stop where you're in a good place, the next day is really easy to pick up because you just have notes to yourself about this is what I'm going to do. And you forge ahead. It makes it much, much easier. This is a common thing that people that write like novels do. They stop when it's going well and pick it up. All right, making a schedule. The most important thing for effective writing is consistency. It's not about the when or the where or the how. Like, be consistent about it. Put it in your calendar. Stick to the schedule. Writing is hard. So we talked about how reading is cognitively challenging. Writing is even more cognitively challenging than reading. So your brain really, really needs to be working well when you're trying to write as best it can function. So how many of you are more like morning people? For those of you that aren't morning people, when does your brain work?
Late morning.
Late morning. Well, 11 p.m., a late person, really late person. So I call myself a morning person, but I don't really get up early. I just get up when I get up, and then I'm effective. So, but it's only in the morning. So if I get up at like 11, I'm in deep trouble because I've lost the morning. But generally speaking, I work pretty well from a late 8 to 11. Also, if I exercise late in the day, know that I have a second burst after my exercise. Unfortunately, that usually conflicts with dinner, so I don't usually use that very effectively very often. Some people are late at night. Some people are occasionally afternoon, not as many, because usually afternoon is a lull. But you have to know what works for you. I worked with two people years ago on a big grant, and one of them was totally a night person, and one of them was totally a morning person. And they had this system where the one guy would write from like 10 p.m. to 3 a.m. and then he'd send it off to the other guy who got up at 4 o'clock in the morning and worked from 4 o'clock until like noon, and they just bounced it back and forth and were incredibly effective. So when does your brain work? When can you think? That's when you write. So this is, it's not really a random week, but is a fairly typical week for me. The top line is 7:30 in the morning. This line is 5 o'clock, and then the dotted line is noon. What do you notice about my calendar? Pardon? Nothing in the morning, right? There's a little bit in the morning on Wednesday. That top one is a conference call or a call with people in China. The next one is a call with people in Vietnam. What's the time difference between here and China and Vietnam? Roughly 12 hours. Do I have a choice of when I meet with them? No, it's either there or it's this one down here which is also a conference call with people in Vietnam. So either I'm up at 9 o'clock at night talking to them, or they're up at 9 o'clock talking. I try very hard to keep everything I have control of in the afternoon. Now, I don't always have control over it. So like there's an editorial board meeting, I can only manage that somewhat. Generally, I stop being effective around 11, so I don't mind having something at 11. But I stack the afternoons and I leave the morning open. Now, some people that are smarter than me will block out their morning. I manage my own calendar, so I know not to put stuff into my calendar, but if someone else has access to your calendar, you better block out the time that you want to write. This is an example of what's called paying yourself first. Pay yourself first means do the most important things for you in the time when you're effective. The most important things for you go first. So if you write best, protect that time, best early or late, protect that time religiously. And then write every day or almost during that time. Try to protect a little bit of time every day to write. Put meetings during that time sparingly, begrudgingly. When a doodle poll comes, I am not available from 8 to 11 because I'm paying myself first. Now, if they go through a couple of rounds and it hasn't worked, I will maybe give it up. Maybe being an operative word there. People are going to try to do stuff then, especially people that don't have to write. Don't let them. Do not let them. The other thing to do, this is a glass, this is while I was at Ohio State, sits on my desk. It's a clear glass and it has rocks in it. And the other thing, much like pay yourself first, is put the rocks in first. So when you have your time, what this means is you put the important things into the jar first. Because if you put the sand in first, there's no room for the rocks. So the sand is what? Your email. It's like scheduling. All those kinds of stuff. It's really easy to take that 1 or 2 or 3 hours that you had and fill it up with stuff that's not important to you. So figure out how to make it work so that you're giving yourself your best self. So because it's so hard on us, write when you're at your best, and don't waste your best time with email and meetings and coding or grading or chart reviews or meetings. Meetings are a huge waste of time 85% of the time. Brainstorming, great. Meetings, not so much. If you ever are the person in charge of meetings, make your meetings useful. How do you make your meetings useful? You are not there to just share information. You're there to get something from the other people's brains. Like coming together to share brain power is a good thing. Coming together for me to tell you that we are in a deficit is not such a useful thing. I can email you and tell you we're in a deficit, and I can probably encourage you to do something differently. Sharing information is generally not needed to be in the same space. I want you to avoid binge writing, and almost everyone is guilty of being a binge writer. So what I mean by binge writing is do not get caught in I need an extended block of time to write. So that means like I block out every Monday to write. You can't run a marathon and win or even run one if you try to run 20 miles every 2 weeks. You have to train every day, right? That means set aside time to make it work for you every day. So I once had a postdoc who was living in Malawi at the time. Her job was essentially to help the local team and all the students that came through, like, publish their papers and things, and then she had to do her own research as well. And I was meeting with her in Malawi, and I was like saying, how is it going? And she said, oh, it's going great. I've got lots of papers out with all these folks. I'm usually like the third or fourth author, but I'm not getting any of my work out. And I said, well, how are you trying to write? And she said, well, I block out every Monday for me to write. And then I said, how's that going for you? And she said, well, it's hard. I don't really get much done. People come to me anyway, even though I've blocked out the time. One of the common things, she didn't say this, but one of the other things that happens when you block out a chunk of time is you waste like the first 2 hours trying to figure out where you were last week. In the meantime, you go and make 4 cups of coffee because you can't figure out where you were last week. And so you just get up and you waste so much time of that one day that you've blocked out. And so I said, well, why don't you try this? Why don't you just commit to writing 15 minutes a day, every day, for the next month? Just make sure you find a block of 15 minutes to do it every day. And she made that commitment. And over the next 2 months, she finished off like 4 papers that had been sort of sitting there for nearly a year and a half. And the reason she was able to do it is because she wrote every day, and most of those 15-minute periods became half an hour or an hour. And the reality is, writing such hard work that we aren't really that effective for more than a couple hours anyway. So this myth of blocking out a whole day where you're going to write a whole bunch, you're going to waste 2 hours in the morning trying to get started, you'll write for 2 hours, and then you'll spend 4 hours feeling guilty that you're not writing more in the afternoon because your brain's not working anymore. So find the time where you can block it out. And if you have other things that are going to get in the way, like you have to do surgery or something, just figure out the days where you can fit it in, and also figure out the little chunks of time that you can squeeze in elsewhere. One of my mentors used to, this is going to sound crazy, but it's true, he liked to play tennis. He belonged to the farm, the faculty club. He would go to the farm, play tennis, play a set, sit down, write for 5 to 10 minutes while they took a break between sets, and then go play tennis again. And he got tons done because he was really focused for those 5 to 10 minutes, and he had cleared his mind from the exercise. Now, that's a unique person, mind you, but it's a good example of getting a ton done in a really short period of time because your brain is in the right space. So you can write in an hour, half hour, or even 15 minutes every day. And writing regularly is critical, and it works much better than binge writing. And this is one of those things where there's actual data. They've studied people who are assistant professors, looked at their writing strategy, and shown that those that write consistently are promoted more frequently and faster than those that binge write. All right. Committing is really important. Having writing buddies is a great strategy. Knowing yourself and where you work well. For the first chunk of my career, I wrote very frequently in coffee shops. I like writing in coffee shops. I have ADHD. You might not think that an environment like that is good, but it's actually great for me because I put my headphones on, and then there's like just enough visual stimuli consistently that I'm not looking off at every little thing. Whereas if I sit in a library, I am in deep trouble every time someone walks by. Every time someone walks by. And then I forget where I'm at, takes like 10 seconds, and then I've forgotten where I'm at. That means that I should check my email. And then I check my email, and then I forget where I'm at, so that means I should read the New York Times. And just because someone walked by, I've lost an hour. So I'm better with a bunch of people around, don't really pay attention to them. If someone's really interesting, I might look up, but I get back to it better. Libraries are way too quiet. Setting session goals can be really helpful. So what I mean by that is pre-writing a little bit. So when you sit down, figure out what you're going to do. It's really, really hard to write a paper. And if you keep thinking to yourself, I'm going to write a paper, you may never start writing that paper. But if you think to yourself, I'm going to write a paragraph, you can do that, right? And then you can use those first few minutes and plan, figure out what your goals are. And these are some examples of common goals. I'm going to write 200 words today. I'm going to revise the draft I finished yesterday. I'm going to write the first 3 paragraphs of the discussion. I'm going to brainstorm and make an outline. I'm going to look at the reviewers' comments and decide which ones to address, and then I'm going to draft an initial response to those. None of these are big, right? Like, these are pretty doable things. And they give you a very tangible unit of something that can be done in that moment. So pause, think about it, look at it, think about what you're going to do, and don't think about it as, oh my goodness, I have to write this whole paper. It's, oh, I have to write, like, I'm going to write a paragraph today. Another thing that can really help, and this is a tip from my wife, is review your storyline every time. So you know what your paper is about, so put that right at the top of the page. So every time you open the document, there's your storyline. Read it and say, oh yeah, this is what this is about. Let me get to it. You have to figure out who you are again, just like when do you work is important, how you work is important as well. So sometimes it can be helpful to write down the big picture first, figure out exactly what the story is. Has anyone been told to vomit on the paper? Usually there's someone that's been told to vomit on the paper. I am not a vomit on the paper kind of guy. What it means is basically sit down and just start writing whatever comes out of your head. Just put it down. That works for some people. And for some people it's hugely helpful, right? But what you end up with is a lot of gemish that's sort of hard to digest. The alternative is sort of thinking too much, thinking for a long time and then sitting. And generally speaking, both of these things can, the whole butt in the chair thing can be an issue. So the first one, you have to get your butt in the chair and then just vomit on the paper. The second one, you just wander around and never get your butt in the chair and you never get anything written. So people tell you to vomit on the paper to get your butt in the chair, but if what you vomit isn't helpful, then it doesn't really work. So figure out what works for you and go with it. And if vomiting works, great. If thinking works, great. But ultimately sit down, put your butt in the chair and write. I definitely am, as I said, I think a lot first and then write, but I do it with, I scribble a lot of thoughts down so that I know what I want to say eventually before I actually start writing in earnest. So don't be afraid to try something different. If you've never tried vomiting on the page and you're struggling to write something, just try it. And if you've been vomiting on the page for a long time, take a step back and see what works.
Question, when you said writing 15 minutes every day, one obstacle for me is that means in my head when I sit down to write, I want to finish a whole section. And that sort of becomes an obstacle. Do you count writing every day as those scribbling your thoughts? What's your
Yeah,
definition
that
of
counts.
writing?
That counts.
I mean, I think that's
Um,
sort of part of the struggle for me.
But I'm going to nudge you to get rid of that,
I know, that part too.
that I need to write a whole section every day, right? Just write a paragraph. That's great. That's cool.
So one of the things I do that I don't know if it's problematic or not is I'll start writing and then, I want to put this sentence in here, but I need a reference for this.
I'm going to talk about that in like 2 seconds.
Okay. And then I start going like this.
Please don't do that. Don't do that.
Yeah.
Don't do that. That's not helpful. All right. So find what works for you. Find the strategies that work for you. Don't be quite like Calvin here and need to go to the school psychologist's office in the meantime. But you have to know yourself and what works. Just like, am I a morning person? Am I an afternoon person? Am I an evening person? When does my brain work? How do I write? Do I think a lot? Am I a perfectionist? We're going to talk about being a perfectionist in a minute. We're going to talk about like that distraction of looking at references in a minute. Like figure out what you do that inhibits you and find solutions around those. So one of the things that can be really helpful is making an outline, but not really an outline that's just like a couple of words. Write down outlines that have real ideas and then use those to craft sentences around them. Maybe write out all of your topic sentences for the whole paper. That'll give you a good sense of what's going to be there. The sort of outlines you learned in elementary school aren't that helpful, but these kind of outlines can be very helpful. Generally, you want to figure out what you're trying to say before you start. Turns out I'm a very linear writer. Like I tend to sit down. I'm going to tell you not to do this in a couple of minutes, but I generally sit down. I write the introduction. I write the methods. I write the results. I write the discussion. That's, if I'm on my own, that's what I do. But in reality, it's often better to write in a different order. And we'll talk about how that can help. But in any case, I try to know exactly what I'm trying to say before I start. One really important thing is our brains don't identify things that are missing as well as they identify things that are there that don't need to be there. So it's really much easier to take something out than it is to say, oh, we missed this and put it in. So from that perspective, it's better to write long first and then shorten. And that's where all that stuff we were talking about last hour is helpful. And especially later on, you're going to get bogged down in trying to make it a clearer paper, and you're going to stop thinking about what's missing here. And that's sometimes where a co-author can be really helpful if you say, can you read this and look through it to see if there's anything logically missing from what I've put in here. Again, periodically printing it out can be helpful. This is maybe a little old school, but if you take something on paper away from your laptop where you cannot edit, you will read it in a different way than you will if you're sitting there with your hands on the keyboard, because you're going to find those, varies that you want to get rid of, or that sentence that begins "there is," you're going to fix that one. That's not the purpose of this. The purpose of this is to read it and make sure all the information is there. Perfection paralysis is a real thing, and a lot of people worry about every single sentence as they're writing it, and they try to get it perfect before they move on to the next one. And this is a little bit where that vomit on the paper comes in. People that have this issue, they'll write a sentence and they won't move on to the next one until it seems pretty good, or really until it's about right, or until it's perfect, and then they'll move on to the next one. That's a really hard way to write. It's much better to move on and fix it later. It's even worse when they try and make it perfect up here before they sit down and write. If you can't write perfectly in your head, no matter how good you are at writing in your head. And if you have perfection paralysis, you will not have great productivity. So to overcome that, keep in mind that rewriting is the whole essence of writing. Embrace revision, learn to edit learn to edit your own writing. So this is one of the things my wife has struggled with, and she has taught herself to draft conversationally. Like, she just puts it out there as if she's explaining it to someone, and then she goes back to fix it. And she's found that that really helps her just get it out there. That way you get the content down, and then you bring it back to the sort of formality. She also uses this journalist technique where she says, I have to have this done by 5 o'clock today, and then she makes a draft. That's again a little bit like vomiting on the paper, like getting it down, and giving herself a deadline really works. Most importantly, understand like where that need for perfection comes from. And we're going to talk about this in a little bit, but the reason why this is here is, so when my wife was in medical school, she went to a medical school where they had a senior thesis. She did her senior thesis, and she had 2 mentors, one of whom was like, this is great, you did a great job, and one was extremely critical of it. And from that point forward, for the next like 10 to 15 years, she had a really hard time writing because she was anticipating that she hadn't made it perfect enough, and she was going to get this criticism from whoever it was that she was getting. And it took her a long time to overcome it, and she's a tremendous writer, but she was always stuck like, someone's not going to think this is good enough. So Calvin actually invented the writer's block. If you just put it on your desk, you can't write there anymore. It works really well. All right, so writer's block is often due to fear. So you have to figure out what you're afraid of. Why is it that you're stuck? Part of it is sometimes you think that your idea is bad. And if your idea is bad, you start to believe that your work isn't good enough. And then you start to think that, well, if my work isn't good enough, other people are going to think badly of me. And then you start to think that I'm not going to succeed, which then takes you back to being not good enough. And from the nods in the room, this is a very common feeling, right? Most of us think we're the only one that ever felt this. But the reality is, it's very common for us to think, this just isn't good enough. I can't give it to someone else. They're going to think I'm an idiot. Like, just try to get over that, and things will be better. And the thing is, it can compound itself. Like when you're stuck and you have writer's block and you're not writing, then you start to feel humiliated because you're not writing. Then you feel guilty, and then you feel ashamed, and then like it just is this terrible cycle. So when that happens, the first thing to do is just forgive yourself and figure out a way to get back to writing. So that may be talking to someone about it. It may be taking a walk. It may be having a cry. It may be whatever it is that you need in that moment. Figure out what it is to move past it. And the fact that I'm standing here in a room talking about scientific writing, telling you about being stuck and needing to cry, means that it's not just you that has this problem, right? Like, people struggle to write, and part of it is getting past it and doing it well. I can't really explain this paper. I can only leave it there for you to observe. And the review is pretty profound as well. I have studied this manuscript very carefully with lemon juice and x-rays, and have not detected a single flaw in either the design or the writing style. Suggest it be published without revision. It's the most concise manuscript I've ever seen, yet it contains sufficient detail to allow other investigators to replicate Dr. Upper's failure. This was a pleasure to examine. All right. So writer's block's really common. You can have it at the paper level. You can have it at the paragraph, the sentence. Essentially, just find a way past it. Start with the easier sections for a paper. Write the methods. Get the results done. Cut and paste material from the protocol. That's one of my favorite things. You just go into the protocol, Control-C, plop it in there. All of a sudden, you've had a whole day's work in like 30 seconds. Another thing, when you're stuck on a section, go ahead and move to something else. Make a note, start the next paragraph, do something else. When you're really stuck, move on to the tables or the figures. Move on to sort of making the figures a little prettier. Work on the references. I'm going to talk about references in a second. Then come back. Just do something that is productive. Sometimes it can help to remember why you're doing this in the first place, both like what the importance of this paper is, but also why this is useful for you in your career, sort of putting it into perspective. That notion of pre-writing will help. Like, figure something small out that you can tackle. Telling someone what you're working on, even if they have nothing to do with what you're working on, can be helpful. Or it can be really helpful to have a writing buddy who's like your peer, where you regularly check in and say, this is what I'm trying to do. Okay, I'm going to check with you in a couple days and see where you've gotten to. And that person checks in with you, and that commitment to each other can be really helpful. Think about it. Think about the projects in chunks, smaller chunks, not the bigger chunks. Like, don't expect to write a section in a day. Expect to write a couple of paragraphs. We all procrastinate as well as panic. So we all do it. Commitment helps. Tell someone. Commit to work for 15 or 20 minutes. Tell your friend you did it. Remind yourself again of why you're writing. That can help. What is the fear? What are you afraid of? Again, similar to writer's block. One of the things that can be helpful is just doing a little imagination for a second of, what am I trying to get away from? And then letting yourself run away, and then you come back to the present and get started. Again, work in short chunks. Take breaks. Breaks are hugely important. And take a real break when you take a break, not a procrastination activity. Because if you start the procrastination activity, then the procrastination will likely start back up. Some people like the Pomodoro method. This is mildly adapted. It can be really helpful. The idea is you put your butt in the chair, you set a timer, like a true physical timer, for 25 minutes. You write for those 25 minutes, get up, take a 5-minute break, repeat times 3, and you've got 2 hours of work done. Then you take a longer break, and if you need to continue, you go back to step 2 and do the process again. This is a very formalized way of ensuring that you build in breaks, but also sort of focusing your time and energy, because you're only committing to writing 25 minutes at a time. It can also be really helpful to take a writing walk. And I think of writing walks in two different spaces. So one is to clear your mind. And when you're writing to clear your mind, the idea is to take a very mindful walk, meaning that you're observing everything around you. You're paying attention to the trees, to the birds, to everything in the space around you. And the other type of writing walk is one where you're very inward, where you're trying to solve something that's been a problem. And it's like you're totally in your head. You couldn't tell whether there were birds out there or not. Those are two very different walks, and you kind of have to decide, or ideally you would decide, what kind of a walk am I going on? Am I going on to clear things out so I can come back with a fresh perspective, or am I trying to figure out something that's been problematic for me? Most of the time for purely writing, it's going to be a clear your mind kind of a walk. The focus and issue is going to be more typically when something's not working and you're trying to come up with a solution. But even then, most of the time you try to focus on it, it's like trying to find that word that's on the tip of your tongue. The harder you think about it, the less likely you are to solve it. So go back to clearing your mind. So a good way to overcome procrastination is to put your butt in the chair, and then what we call the 10-minute rule. Again, I'm going to invoke my wife here. So we tell each other when we're stuck and don't want to do something, we say, I'm going to do this for 10 minutes. Because you can do anything for 10 minutes. And when you can do anything for 10 minutes, that means I really don't want to do this right now. I'd rather be doing just about anything else. I'm going to do it for 10 minutes. Let me go start. What do you think happens? Well, first of all, in those 10 minutes, you get away from everything else. You start writing. 95 to 99% of the time, that 10 minutes turns into a whole stretch of writing because you started. 5 to 1%, that other 5% of the time you write for 10 minutes and you quit. But you still wrote for 10 minutes. So almost always when you try to get away, you can get away. If you're not on call, you can be off the grid. The world will manage. And then you write. And it can be anything. Just write. So another way to overcome procrastination is breaking things into pieces. Remember that you're starting at the bottom level with sentences and you're going to work your way up. You do not have to finish a section in a day. You do not even have to finish a paragraph in a day necessarily. You just need to write something. For PhD students, I often tell them when they're procrastinating, you can't write a dissertation, you have to write a sentence. It is sometimes important to practice creative procrastination, especially when your job requires a lot of writing. And basically, creative procrastination means that you put off the things that are unimportant and procrastinate those while you do the things that are important. Because we have a tendency to say, oh, that's going to be easy, let me do that. And then this next task is easy, let me do that. And then the hour that you had set aside for writing was just filled with all those easy tasks that were not important and could have been done at any point in time. So dare to be average on certain things. That's hard for some of us to do. But as you go further along in your career, it's always about only putting in the energy and effort that is needed for the particular task. And, oops, And being average is often good enough for a lot of things that we do. Sometimes you need time to recover from things, taking a break to recover, a few days, a week, a month, just to give yourself space. And giving yourself space is really helpful to recover for a particular project, and it gives you new energy for that project. So if you have a paper that's like a really important one, and you've spent a long time, it's a pretty good shape, I suggest that don't just send it off right away. Give yourself a week or two, come back to it one last time with fresh eyes. And you'll be surprised how often you find something that's like, oh, I really should be talking about this in this way, and it makes it a cleaner thing. Now don't do that like 5 times, because then you'll never get your paper submitted. But just do it once and it will help. New energy gives new insights. So writing is really hard work, and failure is common. So we're going to end up failing sometimes, and everyone fails. You're going to have bad writing days. Expect to fail at least some of the time, and just embrace that. And the more that you can turn that failure of a day into something positive, either that day, meaning that you did something else because you weren't writing well, like you worked on your figures or whatever, or you turn that failure into positive the next day and figure out like how to fix it. So one of the things for me I know is, like when I've struggled to write something, the rest of that day I'm writing, even if I'm not physically sitting there. I'm like trying in my head to figure out why am I stuck? What is this issue? And the next day I'm usually much more able to work my way through it. It's usually laborious and slow, so you have to be patient. And it takes a lot of thinking. So writing it down is one really good way of sort of improving the thinking. Now, if any of you write grants, drafting a specific aims page in the front really early on can be very helpful in terms of figuring out exactly what you want to do. It can help to jumpstart the process by using existing text. So the protocol gets you started. The hypotheses get you started. The methods jump from the protocol into the paper. Your analysis plan helps you have a plan for how you're going to describe things. And using that existing text will move you along. If you write the results early, that will help you figure out the 1 or 2 main findings and turn them into that story. So sketch out the story really, really early. It can be very helpful to try and explain those 1 or 2 things to someone else that's not an expert. Put it into plain English, and by putting it into plain English, it helps it stick in your own head as this is the simple story that I'm trying to tell. Abstracts at a meeting, great way to get a paper started. You probably had a poster or you had a talk. One of those 2 things. Either one of those, you've got a short little draft of a paper. Write efficiently. So generally speaking, the methods can be drafted at any point in time. You can draft the methods even before the study's done. Make your tables early on. Make shell tables so you know what you're going to put in them before you've even done your analyses. Then draft the results, and the introduction and the discussion typically come after that. Draft your abstract either last or first. So last, I draft it last because I write the whole paper. I figure out this is exactly what needs to go in the abstract. The reason why people write it first is in order to essentially fix in their mind, this is the most important parts of the paper, and I'm going to sort of use that as the main story that will guide me along. Share your drafts early on. Don't be afraid to give someone senior and a junky draft, as long as you explain to them this is a junky draft. Please only look through it for content. Don't try to fix it yet. So share your drafts early and accept criticism. Don't underestimate how many drafts it's going to take. It can take a lot of drafts. So one of my recent major papers, I stand up here teaching you this, it took me 31 drafts for a paper. I was fine, right? Like, there were parts that were me, parts that were my co-authors. It got better. So be patient with that process. And then embrace rewriting as the essence of writing. Don't be afraid to experiment with what you've written. It's not a sign of weakness if you have to like take out a whole bunch. When I take stuff out, especially when I take big masses of stuff out, I put it at the very end of the document so I don't feel like I lost it. And then if I ever need it, I can bring parts of it back. I never delete any drafts until I'm all the way done. In fact, I would say I never delete any drafts ever, but that's just me. Rewriting's really the key. That's how you're going to get all the way through. Delete, delete, delete. Delete's a good thing. You may have experienced this. All right, references. We're almost to the end here. As you're writing, don't let references get in your way, ever. Don't let your lack of certainty about a fact that you're stating get in the way. Almost everything that you think is certain enough is probably certain enough for the paper in that moment. You can always change the language from is to may later, or is probably, whatever. Just write it. And then you put in little squigglies, ref. Keep going. If you know the reference off the top of your head, put a comment with like, you know, Johnson 2017. Keep going. Don't go to EndNote and try to put it in or whatever reference manager you use. So you mentioned before that you would stop and go look up the reference. What happens when you stop and go look up the reference?
Spend like 5 minutes or more.
Yeah, you spend a whole time looking it up. Sometimes you find it. Sometimes you find it right away. When you find it right away, do you come right back? No. You like start looking at it. And then you look at it and you're like, oh, that looks like a pertinent reference there. I think I should look at that one. And then you're on to number 2. And then you're on to number 3. And like 6 hours later, after having done yet another literature review, you're finally coming back. So just avoid that by intentionally not looking. And then one of your writing days is going to be filling in the references. Or even better, one of your days where you have an afternoon where your brain's not that functional, that's a reference day because it's not a high cognitive activity. Find people to write with, commit to one another, share drafts, give feedback. Writing groups work in different ways. I have a colleague where we literally sit in the room together and write. That's less for me and more for her because it makes her come and actually do it. But it's effective, and we can ask questions. When we write grants, we're writing on different parts of the grant at the same time. We can bounce questions off of one another and do it. Other writing groups are more just contact-based, like, what are you working on? I'm working on this. What do you need to get done? How can I help? What do you want me to look at? Those kinds of things. Ideally, your peer editors are a little more critical than this person's wife here. And finally, just to finish up the whole day, my infectious diseases fellowship director, who is also the division chief, once said to me, you should always be writing something. So that goes along with the writing every day thing. So thank you very much. Thanks for the whole day. I hope this was helpful, and good luck with all of your writing endeavors. I am going to finish with just one more little blurb of getting your writing done. Make sure that you prioritize writing, what you write, when you write, get your butt in the chair, don't binge, manage your co-authors, embrace the idea of rewriting, and get a little help from your friends. So thanks everyone. And happy to take any last questions.
Yeah, I have a question. So with the idea of like writing daily,
Uh-huh.
so the example for the researcher Maharu, who had a lot of papers I needed to be done, so I can understand how like it's easy to chunk it up and do every day. But in the instance that you want to write daily, but you don't have like a bunch of things in the pipeline, how do you create, I guess, your pipeline so that you can write daily?
Yeah, so the question there is, how do you create your pipeline so you're writing daily? So writing daily can mean writing all kinds of different things. Writing could mean writing proposals for grants or small projects. Writing daily can mean writing protocols for projects that are ongoing. Writing daily can mean writing the actual manuscripts. Now, if you don't have in your own pool enough going on to be writing all the time, that may mean that you may need to spend some time sort of networking and building your connections to people so that you can be helping with their manuscripts and sort of building your pool of papers, even as a co-author. Because again, you don't have to write the whole thing. You could be editing what they wrote, or you might be writing a paragraph in the discussion, or whatever it might be. But just that development of the pipeline can take a little time. But think also about, are there projects that sort of are languishing that I haven't quite finished? Or another thing is, if you have a mentor who's got a lot of productivity, very often they have papers that they were like, I wish I had written this paper. And that's a paper that you could pick up and move forward. Just like someone was talking about the students in their lab and sort of moving them forward with work. If you just volunteer and say, look, do you have anything that you wish you had gotten out that you didn't get out? How can I help? You will almost always find people that have papers that need help. Because what happens when, like for people that write grants for big projects, you end the project and you get the main papers out and you have like 5 different ideas for more papers, but you have to start the next projects, and then you don't have time. So there's always piles of papers in people's heads that need to be written if you find the right people to help. Another question?
Do you have any tips on making a title for your papers?
Like, the only thing is, just what I said earlier, the main things for titles, people use them to make decisions as to whether to read them, right? So it has to reflect what's in the paper. The second thing is, I'm not a big fan of like really cutesy titles that try to play on words or whatever. I have done a couple of those here and there, but like generally we aren't as funny as we think we are. Then another aspect is like for qualitative papers, people often are including quotes in it. That's okay, but usually it's not really a title for the whole paper, you know? So make sure that it's a title for the whole thing and it really makes sense. I guess like there are some people that really spend a lot of time thinking about titles. I don't spend as much time probably as I should. I just want an accurate headline for what's in there. And that's good enough, I think. It's again one of those things where you could spend a lot of time trying to get the perfect title, but there's only so much. You have this part that's good, and then you have a lot of part that there's not going to get much more benefit from. So find that sweet spot at the top there. All right, it's Friday afternoon. No one actually fell asleep. That's pretty good. So thanks, everyone.